Hello and welcome back to my document here says insert new name here, but we don't have a new name to insert just yet, so I'm not sure what to say, but welcome back to a podcast that we are working on. We've had lots of names suggested that have been brainstormed, we're thinking about. Second Glance, Press On, the 1232 Project, which is based on 1 Chronicles 12:32, the men of Issachar who understood the times and knew what Israel should do. The 1817 Project, that is Proverbs 18:17, which says, once the prosecution goes or somebody goes in court, it sounds convincing until you hear the other side. So thought about that. Sacred Banter, Wits End, all kinds of names. The challenge is that there are over 2 million podcasts out there. I think something like 40% only have 3 episodes before they fold, but lots of names, all the obvious ones have been taken. And I insist, silly me, that whatever name we come up with doesn't sound like a boy band. None of these things are important. These are minor challenges, first world problems, all that kind of stuff. But I just wanted to say a few things about what we're trying to do with this whole podcast before I jump in and talk about Rings of Power. So we are trying to develop a digital strategy. That's because we just, like lots of other churches and businesses, fell into the whole digital world very quickly when COVID hit. We had to, in like 3 days, get a service up and online. And then we just sort of expanded in the digital space. We started daily devotions, the podcast, a whole bunch of stuff. But we did it all without having any sort of plan. So kudos to the tech team and those who worked hard to get this all to work. Now we're trying to figure out exactly what is it that we should be doing and how do we do that and how do we develop it. So the podcast that I did, we did the daily devotions and then somebody said, you should do something on Saturday. And I said, no, I'm not going to. And then eventually I did. And that was called 100 Plus. I was going to do 100 5-minute little church history reflections. Except very quickly, they became not 5 minutes, they became more like 45 minutes. And secondly, it wasn't really church history, it was much more sort of a broad overview of the development of Western civilization, whatever. So those are coming to an end, I think 20 left, so just about have 80 done or 79 done. And the idea is, so what do we do? And by the way, I'm going to double back and fix that because a lot of the first ones are just 5 minutes and it's got a church history theme. And I want to back up to the Greeks and the Romans and sort of reset that. I think all of those could be done better. That'll be an ongoing project. I'm not going to race to finish that. But we'll get through the 100 plus and then we'll start to make that 100 plus a better product. And then start to push that out. But we want to reposition and have a more general interest podcast. I'm not sure that's what we want to say, but we want to have a more open-ended podcast. And we know that we can do it better. So we are working on that. So that's a lot of inside baseball. It's a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff. But I think there's a great opportunity there, and I want to explore that. What I actually am interested in doing, honestly, because I sort of looked at this a couple years ago, Sherry said, you should do a podcast, and I said, I do not have time for a podcast. And then I've heard from some other people saying, you should do a podcast, and I thought, oh my goodness. Sherry's usually right, and just 5 years ahead of time before I come along to that understanding. So I'm increasingly feeling the need to push back. I think there's a lot of information out there, but the challenge that we have at this moment is trying to put all this information in context, to sift it through a biblical lens, and also to figure out what to trust. And so I think there's... Look, I'm not going to be the guy that is going to be doing the scholarly podcasts. I'm not going to be the guy that's going to do the light and flippant podcasts. I'm often told, by the way, when I was first starting to do any video, everybody kept saying, okay, we need to do that again, but with more sparkle. And I was pretty quick to say, I don't do sparkle. But so it's not going to be on the flippant end, it's not going to be on the scholarly end, but somewhere in between there as a pastor, thinking about all the issues that are there and really fighting back against, to me, increasingly, I'm agitated by the way the church, whatever, how you want to frame that, is sort of losing ground to the news or to social media in terms of trying to help shape people's thoughts and shape their lives. So starting a podcast means we got to come up with all kinds of answers to questions like a name and then a tone and then a format. And we're thinking maybe it's 2 days a week. I'm excited in the sense that this would give me an excuse to interview interesting people about interesting topics, books that they've written, articles, whatever. And from time to time, there's probably a solo podcast out there, which is really what this is attempting to pilot. So if we're going to do this a couple times a week, I've got a content calendar that looks at the 100 plus and some other things related to the Lake Light Institute about people that I'm going to need to talk to. Today's podcast is really sort of a last minute thing. Didn't have anything in the queue, was going to take this week off, and then thought, well, maybe there is an opportunity and a need to reflect on the new Amazon series, Rings of Power. And maybe that's the kind of space where I could live and move. Now, I would love, for instance, on something related to Tolkien, who I taught a class on, and so I'm not really preparing for this because I sat down. I don't want to say I did not prepare at all. Keep listening. I didn't prepare. But I spent about an hour skimming some books and looking at some articles and lectures that I've given, and then tried to jot down a few things to prompt a helpful discussion. So the question that I'm going to ask you at the end of this is, are you glad you listened to this? Would you listen to this again? Would you suggest somebody else listen to something like this? So if I was going to do this in the best of all possible worlds, I would try and get someone like President Riken, the president of Wheaton College, who's written a book on Tolkien, to sit down for an interview, and I'd read his book and I'd be ready. But that's not the world that I live in, and so looking to reflect a little bit more in immediate time to topics that maybe I can help you think differently about, frame it a little bit differently. So in the Friday update, and I'm recording this on Friday, so this just came out. I don't think this will drop until Tuesday, but in the Friday update, I mentioned that you have this competition going on all of a sudden between HBO with Game of Thrones, their Game of Thrones prequel, House of Dragons, by J.R.R. Martin, and then Amazon that's put $1 billion, with a B, $1 billion into this Lord of the Rings sort of prequel, sort of midquel, actually. It's called Rings of Power. And Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, also did some stuff in sort of the pre-world. He wrote Silmarillion, which is sort of like a Bible for the Middle Earth. He didn't write about the Middle Ages. That doesn't work. He didn't write about the middle zone between the Silmarillion time, creation time, and the Middle Earth Lord of the Rings time. So I don't know what we call that. It's a prequel to Lord of the Rings, but it comes after Silmarillion. So anyway, Tolkien wrote almost nothing about this middle space, and this is where this Rings of Power is coming out, to try and set up Lord of the Rings. And you've got this battle, this epic battle between what HBO has been enjoying, right? This huge 6-7 year run. Full disclosure, I've not watched Game of Thrones. I didn't start watching it because actually people were a little bit too enthralled by it, and it sounded like, at least initially, I think perhaps there's a little bit less on the nudity side of things. Doesn't really work with the day job. But when I'd hear people talk about something like 24, when the series 24 came out, everybody's like, oh my goodness, I couldn't go to sleep last night because we were, binge watching a whole, new season of 24. I'm like, yeah, I don't need to start something like that. I need to just sort of not get started because I don't want to binge watch 24. So there's a lot of talk about Game of Thrones. I'm familiar with Martin's ideas and his philosophy, and these are so Game of Thrones is very different. It's a very different world. It's a world that doesn't advocate or celebrate virtue. It's much more Nietzschean or Machiavellian in its orientation. And so, but it's got dragons, and then you come over here to look. So Lord of the Rings, Bezos and those guys come in and they say, hey, we want to compete. HBO's making lots of money off of this. Let's come out. And Lord of the Rings is an obvious thing to sort of go with because, it was before Star Wars. It was Star Wars before Star Wars. It was Harry Potter before Harry Potter. Tolkien won just about every award you could win for the 20th century writer. He sort of re-energizes the whole science fiction and fantasy genre. And I'm not a science fiction and fantasy guy, but Tolkien's book, The Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings, the trilogy, which is not really a trilogy, sort of 6 books. It doesn't really work. He didn't really like that you thought about it as being distinct. He wanted it to just be one book, but it's a massive book. He was 17 years late, by the way, in getting it to the publisher. 17 years late. Makes me feel better about missing a deadline every now and then, because I've never, to my knowledge, missed a deadline by 17 years. Anyway, you've got this battle going on between these. And I have watched the first 2. I think tonight they're going to release the 3rd episode of The Rings of Power, which is set in this middle zone. And Amazon stopped allowing people to rate it because the ratings had been so low. So there were 25 million people that watched the first couple episodes of Rings of Power, 10 million people that watched Game of Thrones, House of Dragons. So Amazon wins, 2.5 times as many people watching. But the ratings have been low. And I think maybe they're just not giving it enough time. I don't know. I'm suspending judgment. I was a little underwhelmed. Amazing cinematography. And I get that they're trying to introduce the characters and get you involved. So who knows where that will go. But I thought I could talk a little bit. I've got 8 things that I scribbled down to just help you understand what you're watching if you're watching it. And because I think there's a lot that we can think and learn here. So first of all, let me say some things about Tolkien. So John, what's John's middle name? J.R.R. Tolkien, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. And I made a little note about the fact that it's George R.R. Martin and John R.R. Tolkien. So if you want to have a child that's going to write a epic best-selling saga, apparently you need to give them 2 middle names and they both need to start with R. So John R.R. Tolkien was a British academic born at the end of the 19th century. And he was, by his own description, a hobbit in everything but size. So hobbits lived in a hole in the ground. They were sort of these pre-modern, simple in one sense, lovers of trees and lovers of nature and simple people. He described himself as a hobbit in everything but size. So hobbits are halflings. They're half as big as normal people. Tolkien was very much a guy of the medieval era. He was very pre-modern in his thinking. He was born in South Africa. His parents were Brits, but his dad was on some government assignment. They went to South Africa. He was born there, as was his brother Hilary. But his mother hated South Africa, and so she took the boys and went back to England. And the father was trying to wrap things up, and then he was going to follow her. But he got sick shortly after they left, and he died. So Tolkien will grow up without his father. They get back. They get back to England, to what he says, to the Shire, okay, which is where the hobbits live, when he's 3 years of age. And he becomes then, his mom will live for a few more years. He's widowed, or he's orphaned at the age of 12. She dies, but she becomes a Roman Catholic in sort of opposition to her family, which is Church of England, and there was some more tension there at that time. And so J.R.R. Tolkien grows up in the Shire, pre-modern England. He grows up there as a Roman Catholic. And when his mom dies, he and his brother will be raised as Catholics by a priest. The priest will sort of adopt them and take care of them. And they will have to move into the city, which Tolkien hates. It's sort of everything modern, and he goes from the idyllic Shire to, I don't know, to something else. But he is very bright. So part of the reason they move into the city is because he gets into good schooling. They don't have any money. They're very poor. But because he is so exceptionally bright, he begins to move up through the ranks of British society. And he is early on a lover of languages. So he is going to eventually get to go to Oxford, and he is going to become a philologist, so a student of languages and the development of languages. So in The Lord of the Rings, he will develop, I think, 3 languages just to write some of the poetry. Like, he develops the language and then writes poetry in those languages in Lord of the Rings. But that all comes very natural to him. So another thing, second thing to know about Tolkien, is that he becomes very good friends with C.S. Lewis. They share a lot in common. Both of them love languages, and they're both very anti-modern in their orientation. They do not like what they see happening. Part of what they see happening grows out of the fact that they both are severely injured in World War I. Tolkien fights in the battle of Somme, and it's a horrific battle. It's the Germans against the English and the French, and it's one of the most wicked battles of World War I. And if you read about it in Wikipedia, which I did this morning, it just says there was just wave after wave of the slaughter of young British men. So Tolkien is not killed in this battle, although several of his friends are. A good percentage of his classmates out of Oxford are. But he then gets trench fever, which is very serious illness, almost dies of it. He spends months, if not the better part of a year, sort of convalescing. He graduated from Oxford as a student and got married, and then goes immediately into becoming a British officer, and then gets sick. So Lewis, C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of Narnia guy, the Christian apologist, Lewis is left for dead on the battlefield. He is shot, and so they both have this experience in which they hate. So World War I is called the Great War at the time. It is the first time you have sort of this massive industrial mechanized war. And it's a new thing. You've got tanks, you've got gas warfare, you've got all these things. It's a different level of horror. Wars are always changing, weapons are always changing, but it's a different level of horror. And they have huge reactions to it. They're these guys that love the past, that love the Middle Ages, that love the stories, the Arthurian legends and other things. They love languages. And at Oxford, they become friends. And at the time, Lewis is an atheist. He had become an atheist as he was growing up, being tutored by the great Knock in sort of a really rigid rationalism. And he's an atheist. But over time, he is sort of, as he says, if you're an atheist, you have to be really careful about what you read. A young atheist can't be too careful about what they read, because as more ideas are coming to him, he finds himself being pulled. Not interestingly, he will write as an apologist, and he'll be so clear and thoughtful and sort of linear and logical in the explanations of the Christian faith. And lots and lots of people will find Lewis just this clear thinker. That's not really what wins him over. It's more of what Tolkien is saying to him, that he calls him Jack. Jack, the reason you love these ideas, we talked about this a little bit in the last podcast on modernism. The reason you love these ideas is because Christianity is the true myth. It's the true story. And this resonates deep within you at levels that you cannot necessarily rationally respond to. So Tolkien will be involved in leading Lewis to faith. They get in this book, they're reading these old stories, these old northern stories, and during reading those stories, that Lewis learns, Icelandic in order to join these stories, Viking tales and other things. Over their years of friendship, Tolkien will be involved in leading Jack to faith in Christ. And then they will be great friends and read each other's writings and encourage each other in the writings that they're doing. Lewis will become famous for his broadcasts on the BBC that will lead to him writing Mere Christianity and Screwtape Letters and Problem of Pain and all these other things. And then when he's criticized by some professional theologians who are undoubtedly jealous, when he's criticized for some of his writing and thinking theologically, he will stop doing that, and he will escape sort of into writing children's stories. So he'll write the Chronicles of Narnia. And Lewis and Tolkien and others, Tolkien's son, Christopher, and Dorothy Sayers and others, will form these writing groups where they'll critique each other's writings, called the Inklings. They meet at the Bird in the Bath, or the Child and the Eagle. The Eagle and the Child is the name of the restaurant. The nickname of it is the Bird in the Bath. And they will meet there. If you go there, I've been there. There's a little plaque on the wall. This is where the Inklings met. And they will read each other's writings and critique each other and encourage one another. And they will remain friends up until Lewis marries Joy Davidman, who I just quoted in the sermon. I haven't preached this sermon yet, but I'm going to quote Joy Davidman in the sermon this weekend from her book, Smoke on the Mountain, on the Ten Commandments. Davidman had been in the U.S., had been chased out of the U.S. She and her first husband were Marxists, and they get and they're making films. And they get chased out of the U.S. by McCarthy. They're accused by McCarthy. This is one time he got it right. They're accused of being communists. So they flee the U.S. and they end up in Britain. He is beating her. She divorces him. She then goes on a spiritual journey and will start to correspond with Lewis about her spiritual interests. But she also gets sick. She gets cancer. She's got 2 kids that she's raising. She's got cancer. She's in the hospital. She comes to faith. She's still writing to Lewis. When the Brits figure out who she is, that she's this Marxist, she's now changed from being a Marxist. But when they figure out that the U.S. was after her, they're going to deport her. She's dying. Lewis says, "You cannot do this," and he marries her, not in a romantic sense of love, just out of, I'm going to marry her so you cannot deport her. And then she gets better. And so now they're married. And so then they will actually have a courtship and get married by an Anglican priest and live as husband and wife for a few years before cancer reemerges and she dies. But Tolkien will be so frustrated with Lewis that he has married this woman. He thinks that that marriage is this serious sacramental thing, and you can't just marry this woman to keep her in the U.S. That actually will be a rift in their friendship. I don't believe they reconcile until just before C.S. Lewis, Jack Lewis, dies. So anyway, they are lifelong friends. You need to know. So you need to know that Tolkien was a hobbit. You need to know that he's the spiritual mentor to C.S. Lewis. You need to know that the books that he writes, so Silmarillion, The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, and then a bunch of other stuff, professionally as well as other things in sort of a middle space. He writes these, especially the Lord of the Rings, as works of Christian truth. He's smuggling truth under the radar. Now, he says that when he initially wrote Lord of the Rings, he did not recognize it as a overt work of, as a conscious effort to write a Christian book. But then, after his first draft was done, he realizes that that's exactly what it is, and more consciously, he tweaks it that way. So he is a devout Christ follower, devout Catholic, and his books are efforts to smuggle Christian truth in under the radar. Now, he does not see them as works of allegory. As a matter of fact, he's really down. He's quite critical of Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia because he thinks the whole idea of Aslan, having a Christ figure, the lion in the Chronicles of Narnia, he thinks that's just bad, simple. What Lewis does, to Lewis's credit, it's really hard to pull off a totally good figure. It's really hard to have a Billy Budd. It's really hard to have a totally good figure who's not somehow cheap or thin or just, I don't know. I think with Aslan, Lewis does as good a job as anybody could. But they're pushing back. Both Lewis and Tolkien are pushing back on modernity. They're smuggling in Christian truth, and in the same sense, they're pushing back on modernity, which is this critique of Christendom. And it's this celebration of man. It's sort of got this Enlightenment-infused thinking, of course. Humans are good. Man is the measure of all things, not God. Utopian ideals. No real concept of sin. With a little bit more time and education, things will be great and move forward. So they're very much writing against this. And they're interestingly, part of a cadre of people who do this, coming out of World War I or battles around that time, who all are traumatized by it and write against it, but they don't write fiction. They write these epic battles of good versus evil, or not allegories, but they write stories that are portraying good versus evil. So you get this with William Golding, Lord of the Flies. Lord of the Flies, right? Beelzebub, that biblical name for Satan. But you've got the British school children on the island, and it becomes this battle of good versus evil. You get this with Animal Farm, George Orwell writing. It's subtle conflicts between good versus evil. Chronicles of Narnia from C.S. Lewis, Lord of the Rings with Tolkien. There are others. Kurt Vonnegut is not injured, but he was present at the bombing of Dresden, which is a horrific World War II destruction of that town. And so he writes Slaughterhouse-Five. So all these people are trying to wrestle with these big ideas of good versus evil. Tolkien doesn't believe you can do it in a straight-up allegory, but there's a lot of Christian symbolism in Lord of the Rings. So he divides up. Lewis has Aslan as the Christ figure. Tolkien will divide up the offices of Christ, prophet, priest, and king. So the prophet will be Well, the priest is Frodo, and the prophet's Gandalf. The king is Aragorn. And so you've got these aspects of Christ's office that get divided between these people. You've got this ongoing discussion about the insidious and ultimately destructive, malforming power of sin. So Gollum had been a hobbit, but he gets destroyed by the ring, right? And he loses himself. He will never talk about he never uses the word I. It's always we, he and his precious, the ring, right? He's lost his identity into this ring of power, which is ultimately a destructive force. It's modernity, it's evil, it's all controlling. You see that evil is banal, it's repetitive, right? You've got all the beauty of the Shire and the beauty of the music, and you've got all this celebration that the hobbits love, and then it gets compared to Mordor, which is just dark and ugly, and the orcs and the trolls and all these things. They're just destructed, malformed elves and dwarfs and all these things that can be good, but evil is these things corrupted in different ways. By the way, Mordor, hell, but when Sam, and Sam, by the way, is the hero of Lord of the Rings. If there's a hero, Frodo and Gandalf, but Sam is the hero in the sense that Tolkien wants to celebrate friendship. He sees camaraderie as incredibly important. Community is incredibly important for us in our battles against evil. But as they're moving through the marsh, there's that scene where they're trying to get to Mordor, and all the dead bodies. That's the battle that Tolkien had been in, where there's so many young British soldiers had been killed, and the bodies are just lying, piled up deep. That's Tolkien going through that. But he's writing this big story in which good is going to triumph over evil, but not by using evil's power, not by using the ring. Power is found in weakness. It's the hobbits, it's the halfling, right? The half man with no power who is going to do the unthinkable. Sauron, right? The big eye, big brother. There's a little bit of 20th century overlap there. Tolkien writes Lord of the Rings, starts in, I think, 37 and then ends it after Hitler's destruction. So he's writing very much about his battle, World War I. He's writing about Hitler, World War II. He's writing about air warfare. You see that in some of the dragons that the Nazgul are flying on and other things. He's writing, you've got Orwell stuff coming out, Big Brother, and the all-seeing eye that is, there's no freedom. All of these are Christian themes that he is developing. And Frodo will do the unthinkable. He will take the ring of power, and he's able to get away with this because it's unthinkable to Sauron that somebody who has the ring, which is what he's after, that he'll throw the ring away, right? But this is a big theme for Tolkien. He did not want the British to use the power. He was against the bombing of Germany and the German civilians. He was against the Brits doing to the Germans what the Germans had done to the Brits. He says, we cannot use the ring of power to try and defeat evil. You cannot use evil to defeat evil. I'm getting together with a couple guys this weekend, and we're watching a documentary which I've started to watch called Gatekeepers, and it's interviews with 6 of the Shin Bet leaders. So this is in Israel. They are the head of the counter-terrorist organizations. And I've watched enough of this to know, I didn't know anything about it when I started watching it. I watched enough of this to know that part of this documentary is this is this exploration of how these men get damaged by fighting the battles they're fighting. And there's this moral injury, to use that term, that is growing in its popularity here. So you have Tolkien trying to stop moral injury and saying you cannot use evil to defeat evil. And you've got these themes of sacrifice. Frodo will ultimately sacrifice himself in trying to get rid of the ring, but he will be too damaged to live on, right? He will eventually, I guess that's a spoiler alert if you haven't read the books, which I recommended you do. By the way, I said Rings of Power, too early to know. This is in the Friday update. Too early to know whether you should watch it or not. I'm going to watch it, and I'll tell you whether you should watch it once it's over. So perhaps there's a spoiler alert, but I recommended that you read the books. And if you've got kids over the age of probably 5 or 6, because it can be pretty scary. I scared one of our children. He had nightmares, which I did not see cause and effect until my wife pointed out. Of course the kid's crying at night. You've traumatized him by reading that incredible book about all these ghouls and dragons and all this stuff. So, but once they're 6 or 7, reading The Lord of the Rings to them, and it'll take months, but hey, there you go, create a memory. So, third thing I'm saying about Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, is that these books were his efforts to smuggle truth under the radar. Fourth thing, just by way of context, you should know, huge success. Again, Lord of the Rings in the early part of the 20th century was the Star Wars franchise. It was the Harry Potter franchise. Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling sold more books. I think the last I saw was that it was estimated that Tolkien's books had been read by 150 million people, sort of won, again, all the awards for being the 20th century author, which a lot of people, the elite, really didn't like, because these books were seen as being too, they just weren't the right genre, and Tolkien was this, conservative. I'm not talking about politically conservative, although he was very politically conservative. He's sort of, he wasn't an advocate of democracy. He sort of wanted the king. I mean, he's sort of a medieval guy in the 20th century. But 150 million people, and I think Rowling has sold 400 million books. On the book that I've just am coming out with right now, called How Do You Know? I talk a little bit about that the Bible is, selling 80 million copies a year, and you got to drop down to like 1 million a year in 2021. There are 2 books that sold 1 million copies in 2021. I was looking at all-time sales, and I was a little shocked to see you've got the Bible, then you've got the works of Mao, and then you've got J.K. Rowling, 400 million copies. Now, I'm trying to figure out where the Quran fits in there, and I haven't figured that out just yet. But anyway, huge success, Lord of the Rings, huge success. Critics hated it, but they liked, by the way, a lot of critics liked Peter Jackson's film representations, and I thought the films were actually quite good as well. They leave some things out. They leave out, for instance, Tom Bombadil and the whole celebration of music and joy and that side of things. They leave out the ending. Jackson doesn't do the ending. He doesn't do the hobbits, Merry and Pippin returning to the Shire to find that the Shire has been destroyed. Right? This isn't a good versus evil where good wins and everything is happy ever after. Evil has come. And so the Shire has been destroyed. But the Merry and Pippin are able to deal with this. They've been on this adventure. They're now very different people. But Tolkien, by the way, who had been worried. We know this because we read his correspondence with his son Christopher. We read his journals. We read lots of articles, correspondence with C.S. Lewis and other things. He had been very worried about retirement. Didn't know how he was going to pay for it. Been a professor at Oxford. You would have thought that was going to pay for retirement, but he was very worried about how he and his wife were going to survive. And then Lord of the Rings comes out, which Lewis gets him to publish, and he becomes very wealthy. Hates the fame, but very, very wealthy. Number 4, I've already talked about the fact that he was very impacted by World War I. That was my number 5. Number 6, Rings of Power. So the Rings of Power is set in this middle time frame between the Silmarillion, the sort of the creation myth that he creates, and this that Tolkien sets up to sort of explain what's going to happen, and then you got the Hobbit with Bilbo. By the way, learned something just this week. Frodo, so Bilbo's nephew, the Hobbit, it's all about Bilbo Baggins, a respectable hobbit who goes on an adventure, which hobbits were not supposed to do. Bilbo is the star of the Hobbit, which is much more of a kid's book. And then because it does so well, the publishers want another one, and Tolkien wants to show them some of the other things he's been working on, and no one's interested. And so then he talks about this whole new book that sort of extends from the Hobbit, and they love that. He has Bilbo's nephew, Frodo, initially named Bingo Baggins. I think Frodo's a much better name, but he sets this up, and so they go, yeah, we want it. And that's when it then takes him 17 years after his deadline to get that turned in. But Lord of the Rings comes here. Rings of Power is setting up Lord of the Rings. Comes after the Silmarillion, sets up Lord of the Rings. And it's very different from what Martin is doing in Game of Thrones, because in Lord of the Rings, in Middle-earth, in Tolkien's universe, you have good and evil. And evil is ugly and bad. Good is good, but it's hard. And good characters are not perfectly good, because we're not perfectly good. Frodo, in particular, you see Frodo is increasingly corrupted by the ring. He's corrupted by sin, and he's wrestling with it. He needs, ultimately, in the end, he needs his friend, Sam Gamgee, to get him to the end. He couldn't have done it on his own. The evil is overtaking him. It's corrupting him. It's killing him. And it is, and you see, and interestingly, you see Gollum. I mean, just to show how complicated this is, Gollum, who's this wisp of a hobbit. I was going to say wraith. The wraiths, the ring wraiths, right? They've also been corrupted. They had been good kings, but they've been corrupted by evil. And so now they become this vacuous kinds of beings. Gollum, though, showing, and there's no God figure, there's no church, there's no prominent religion in one sense in this world, but good is able to use evil. Gollum will actually save Frodo's life at one point. And but it's good is, I don't want to say complicated in the way evil is complicated, but it's nuanced. And so you've got this world where good is good and virtue is right, and you're recognizing this, and there's beauty and there's wholeness. And in Martin's world, there is no God and there is no value to virtue. Virtue is you're still going to die. So it's, win or die is not win or die, it's sort of win and die, because there's no ultimate value for virtue. And the world, again, it's sort of it's much more of the Nietzschean, it's all that's going to matter here is power. And Tolkien is actually warning about that, right? Tolkien is warning that if you give up the world, the enchanted world, the world inhabited by God. You give up this world. And for him, in this myth, it's, there's hobbits and there's dwarves and there's elves and there's all these other things. This enchanted, he used the word, I'll get canceled. He used the word fairy, talked about fairy stories. And to him, fairies were not in any way timid or effeminate or childlike. They were very different than that. He tried to hold on to that world. He writes in defense of fairy stories, because he thinks that there is this world that we need to live in. It's not the modern world, it's the medieval world, and it's a world that is open and enchanted by the things of God. And you need to lean into that and to hold on to that. And it's complicated because we're living in a world that's broken, but there is good and there is more to it than this thin world that we see. And so you've got these two different sagas going on. House of Dragons, the Game of Thrones prequel, and Rings of Power. So I don't know whether or not Rings of Power is going to turn it around. I'm a little nervous that the Amazon Empire is not going to fully appreciate the importance of the Christian subtext and all that goes on in that context. Part of me says, they probably will. I mean, there's some people that are knocking Rings of Power because it's too woke. Well, no, look, Tolkien wrote, one of the knocks on Tolkien is that he wrote this huge saga, and almost all your characters are men. There's like almost no women there's fewer women in the book than there are in the movies, and there's hardly any women in the movies. They added some women to the saga that Peter Jackson will come up with. And the men, you've got language here that is not, I don't think in any sense, designed to be racist. And we've got writings, we've got all kinds of backstories from Tolkien in which he's not racist. And he's writing at one point to get his books into Germany after the war. And for some reason, he's being questioned as to whether or not he has any Jewish ancestry, sort of a throwback to World War I or World War II, or maybe it's still going on. And he writes and he says, I do not have any Jewish ancestry, but I wish that I did. I would love to claim that. And so you've got the dark underworld. I don't think there's racist overtones there. So some of the pushback on the fact that you've got, black hobbits and lots more strong women characters in the new Rings of Power, I'm not really all that excited about some of the critiques that people are offering against that. That makes sense to me. I don't know where they're going with it. To actually have a good, rich, robust story, you often have to have a lot of character development at the beginning. We're not very patient with our stories anymore. I remember I just had to read 400 pages in a novel that somebody kept telling me I had to read because it was great. It was going to be great in the second half. That's a big investment. And it wasn't Thoreau, but it was, good night. I can't think of this guy's name. But a famous 21st century lawyer. He's got all these books out. It'll come to me later on. Don't email me about that. But anyway, he has adventure and action and a bombing going off in the first paragraph, because you got to hook people right away. We're not patient. But it takes some time to help you fall in love with characters and to understand the backstory and all that. So I've not given up on Rings of Power. Dramatic cinematography. They're using the $100 million per episode to have some great special effects and some great cinematography. But the story's a little slow, and I don't know where it's going. So read the books. Read Lord of the Rings. I will tell you if Rings of Power is worth reading. And if you're so inclined, I would be curious in your feedback on something like this as a podcast, which is sort of more a little bit spontaneous and a little bit just rambling, Woodruff talking for an hour. But if there's value there, perhaps we'll do this more often. I hope you have a good week. God bless you.